Welcome to Decision Analyst Insider Series webinar on what is the future of tracking research. My name is Christy Allen. I am the Marketing Director at Decision Analyst and the moderator today. Before I introduce our presenters, I have a few notes for everyone. In the handout section, there is a copy of today's presentation along with some relevant papers. Also, please feel free to ask questions by typing in the chat box. We will attempt to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. If we don't answer your question during the webinar, someone will respond to your question within a day or two. Today's presenters are Bonnie Cannoli, Executive Vice President. Bonnie leads and conducts consumer insights, research, and analytic consulting for Fortune 100 companies. And Felicia Rogers, Executive Vice President. Felicia has worked with companies of all types and sizes to build brands, develop new products, improve marketing, and create satisfied customers. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Bonnie.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, The Future of Tracking Research. My name is Bonnie and I am here with Felicia Rogers, and we are going to kick off our discussion. First of all, we want to talk a little bit about what tracking is including in our minds, what we're thinking of. Advertising tracking, brand health, brand equity, market structure, customer satisfaction and loyalty tracking, as well as customer experience. So essentially, all of these things obviously have very different objectives and therefore very different deliverables at the ending point. But we're going to focus on the parts that are similar among them and talk more in generalities about the group. And so Felicia is going to talk the next slide, and we're going to go back and forth today.
Great. Thank you, Bonnie. Well, as we get into our conversation today about tracking and what the future looks like, we really ought to keep in mind that there are really several things that affect tracking. There are lots of key shifts that are taking place out in the world, and these things are affecting the needs and the designs, whether the tracking is being conducted internally by your consumer insights team with your DIY, do-it-yourself tools, or whether you're partnering with an agency or a supplier. The most critical thing that's kind of the overarching factor here is the fast pace of the business climate in today's world. We all know that things are moving faster and faster every day, which is having an impact on decision making. It's having an impact on how quickly we're trying to learn and react to all different marketing elements and impacts. And along with that, we know that we have shrinking corporate budgets, and from a survey perspective, we're seeing declining response rates from consumers. In addition to that, there are just massive amounts of data really flowing into our companies and businesses these days. We all, of course, talk about this with the term big data. But there are things, of course, like sales data, distribution data. Those have been around for a long time, but let's put on top of that social media data, all of the GPS types of tracking information that we're able to gather today. And of course, the question is, how do we use that? There's government data available. There are lots of syndicated sources for data. So again, there's just this massive amount of data available. And with all the data and all the computing power that we have at our fingertips, corporations and other organizations are finding themselves tempted, and really rightly so, to kind of get their arms around all of this data and utilize not only survey tracking, but all the other types of data to kind of monitor their business performance.
So let's talk a little bit about the tracking must-haves. What do we really need to have in order to do a good job for our businesses? The first identified area that we're going to talk about is relevancy. If the questions are not relevant for driving the business, then we really need to think about why are we collecting this data and spending money for it. So the next item, which is also very intertwined and interlinked, is actionability. If we know we're going to change a marketing program, promotion, or pricing, or distribution, or something based on a significant change in a metric, it's the right kind of thing to put in our tracking study. But if we can't answer that question positively, then we need to really think about whether it should be in our tracking study. And then obviously it goes without saying timeliness is critical. The best, most actionable, relevant data in the world cannot help our businesses if the reports and if the information isn't available to us very quickly. And so dashboards and automated reporting are often very important to achieve this, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. One of the other things that we wanted to bring up here is we have a quote from Simon Chadwick that really talks about the role of the researcher or the consumer insights professional, and that is of an advocate, consultant, influencer. So again, you have to think about the relevancy, actionability, and timeliness of what you're designing and what you're delivering to businesses and how you can be a better advocate and consultant to your business.
So before we go any further, let's talk just for a moment about the history of tracking. And like Bonnie said earlier, we're talking about things like brand health tracking, advertising tracking, and also customer experience tracking. And there's certainly a long history with all of these types of tracking research. Most of it, in fact, was conducted by telephone before, let's say, the mid-1990s. That was the gold standard, the way that much data collection was performed. And at that time, tracking studies, and in particular brand health and advertising awareness and usage types of tracking, were really more focused than they are today on key metrics. Some of the things that really were those actionable and relevant types of insights or questions that were needed. And this meant that the questionnaires at that time were a bit shorter than they are today, and that made it pretty manageable to do surveys by telephone. Of course, they weren't all very short and sweet, but it was a manageable process. Over time, we've seen technology, and this goes back many years, but we began to see the technology make an impact from a telephone perspective, where residents, households were using things like caller ID to help screen their phone calls. They began to have fewer and fewer listed telephone numbers, which impacted parts of the way we were able to pull sample. More recently, as we all know, people have began to get rid of their landlines, and so that started to have an impact several years ago. And so all of this has kind of led to the falling response rates, the falling capability, really, or the lessening of our capability to reach consumers when we need to find them, and in a positive way. So around the mid-1990s, again, tracking research and all kinds of research really began to migrate over to the internet. And at that time, we also started to see the development of online panels as a sample source, and those, of course, have grown significantly over time. And at that time, all of our research, again, was conducted online. So couple all of this technology type of impact with the fact that companies were becoming more and more aggressive with new product development. We were seeing lots of line extensions, a proliferation really in the number of products and SKUs that are on the shelves. Lots of mergers and acquisitions were taking place. So companies were, at the time that we were beginning to face some challenges with tracking research, companies were also needing to track more and more brand names, product categories, and product types. And so questionnaires, as many of us know, have become very bloated, much longer and more complicated than they used to be, which in turn required much larger budgets than in the past.
And so now we're going to talk a little bit about the tracking of today, which is basically building on the history that Felicia just laid out for us. Even today, the long online surveys are very long and complex, again, because of the multiple brands and businesses that many of our clients are in. It leads to significant respondent fatigue, and we have to ask ourselves, you know, what is the quality of the data we are collecting? The technology advances. Now we're looking at attention spans of respondents that are shrinking. We are looking at more and more people shifting to doing their surveys on a smartphone or a tablet, and cooperation rates are dropping. And then we also see even more online sample sources, which is great in some ways, but can also be a difficulty to overcome. We may find the same consumers or the same respondents on multiple panels. We also may find that the panels were recruited in ways that we don't fully understand. So the scientific part of sampling becomes more and more difficult. We've also seen a less representative population, and that has to do with more of the consumers who are in particular younger and men not frequently being on these online panels, and fewer people checking emails in general. So it's a growing problem in terms of sampling.
So that leads us to the big question that many people are talking about, is this the death of tracking? And in short, our response to that question is no, it is not the death of tracking. But we certainly realize and believe wholeheartedly that these legacy trackers that have been kind of the mainstay for several decades now are beginning to go away. They are beginning to morph into something different, and we probably will very soon see that, you know, these large-scale sort of behemoth types of trackers will very quickly begin to disappear. But companies still need to track their performance. So again, tracking is not dead. It's just that we're going to be doing things differently. This has already begun, and we believe it will continue. Company performance has to be looked at from multiple angles. And so from a marketing research perspective, some form of tracking will still be used. We've got to continue to measure and monitor key things like brand awareness and advertising awareness, imagery, all those important types of performance measures for not only your own brands, but very importantly, these types of tracking studies help you monitor what's going on with your competitors, what consumers are thinking just overall from a kind of a landscape perspective. Tracking data is and will still continue to be used to feed into marketing decisions. We do and will continue to use marketing or tracking types of data alongside other data sources like marketing mix modeling, things like that, to help us drive decisions on media planning, marketing planning, the things that we need to know to help us understand, you know, when, where, and how we're going to advertise, for example. And then, of course, customer experience monitoring is another important form of tracking that will certainly be here for the foreseeable future. We've got to continue to make sure that those customer-facing associates, for example, are continuing to keep customers happy and generate repeat business. And certainly, there are many companies who today are using some of those findings to compensate employees or various levels of management, and we believe that will continue for the foreseeable future.
So then the question becomes, what is it that we do, now we've decided we're going to do some form of tracking. How is it that we design this tracking research, and how do we move forward with this? We believe that the first step and a very important critical point is to start with some qualitative. And that is both a qualitative interview and review of data with your internal stakeholders, whether that be conducted by your team or whether that be conducted by your consumer insights vendor or supplier. We believe that you need to spend time with these key stakeholders to understand what is it they really have to know, what actions will be taken if we see those metrics going up and down, so that we can make sure we have the have to knows in there and not the nice to knows. In addition, the depth interviews and focus groups among your end consumers would be very important to, again, understand the nuances of the decision process, key elements that may have changed over the years in terms of how decision making is being done, and make sure that we are using the right consumer language and that the tracking study is really focused in on the things that are most important to the consumer.
The next thing to consider or act upon in either developing a new tracking study or maybe kind of morphing one that has been in place for a while is a really good solid review of existing data. We need to make sure that the parties that are involved in shaping the tracking of the future really understand any recent qualitative and quantitative data that you have available. In addition to that, we want to make sure that there's a really good understanding and examination, I guess, if you will, of industry data that may be available from other sources. So this solid foundation really helps us pinpoint the needs for information in this tracking study design process. And where appropriate, we can incorporate some statistical analyses of past data to help us identify what are the key drivers of purchase, for example, or of satisfaction as another example. And those are really those things that need to be critically included in the tracking going forward. And as Bonnie mentioned previously, there may be some other things that could be put aside.
And so the next step, we've done the qualitative, we've analyzed all the existing data. The next step, and obviously the whole point of this, is to funnel into what we would call a tight and engaging questionnaire. So we are now looking for ways to get at those critical KPIs, the right performance indicators, make sure we use as few questions as possible, simple scales, engaging question types where we're not just having consumers go through, tens or, 20, 30 different attributes. So we really want to make sure we're using engaging question types. We can do logos and drag and drops. We can include video questions perhaps. So really there's a lot that can be done in terms of making that a more engaging experience. And the best trackers for today and for the future will also include modules where there are some nice to knows that really are important to your business. So one way to handle that would be to make a smaller set of people. If you have 1,000 people, let's say, maybe 200 of them after the key questions go into this module A and then 200 go into module B. So we can use those modules to help get at some information that we really need to know as well.
And then another very, very important element of designing any tracking study is the sample. We've got to make sure we're including the right people, getting to them at the right times. And so we've got to make some decisions about the sampling. Things from a timing perspective are to consider are, do we need to be in the field interviewing every single day of the year, or do we want to do things in waves or in pulses? There are pros and cons to doing those either way, and there are reasons why you would be in the field every day, continuously, versus, say, monthly, quarterly, or even annually. The other issue here is the sample sources. So where are we going to find the people that we survey? As Bonnie mentioned earlier, there are so many sources for sample now that you've got to be really careful and make critical decisions about, what are we getting from sample source A, B, and C to ensure that you've got a good representation of, maybe it's the entire population or maybe it's a subset of the population. Also, we've got to make sure we're getting to those demographic groups or subsets of the population that are more likely to use a laptop computer, for example, and those who are very unlikely to use a laptop or a desktop and do most of their computing and internet interaction with a mobile device like a tablet or even a mobile phone. So we've got to have a good mix of sources to make sure that we are including everyone who needs to be surveyed and that the sample itself doesn't set up any kind of a bias. And then you've got to make decisions about the sample size. For example, is 200 completes enough, or do we need 2,000 or 3,000 completes? And the questions that drive those decisions are, how many different ways do we need to break down the data to analyze the results and share out with our key stakeholders and other constituents, things like that. And so the most important question then is, who? Again, we've got to make sure that we're reaching the right people, and the key thinking and recommendation is to always go as broad as possible with the sample. Say your product is a consumer packaged good like snack cakes. So do you include only snack cake consumers in your sample for tracking of your brand health and your competitors, or do you go broader than that? We would always recommend going broader than a current consumer group or a current target audience, because maybe there's a new revolutionary snack cake that hits the market 6 months from now, which really totally changes our pool of category users. We would miss the impact of that if we had been focused too narrowly. So the decision, typically, the right decision is going to be going broad with your sample.
And during the time we were on this topic about tight, engaging questionnaires and the right people, someone sent in a question that had to do with what is our definition of a tight questionnaire and what kind of recommendation. So someone's asking, they currently have a 30-minute questionnaire, and what would be our recommendation?
That's a great question, and one that probably most of us struggle with on an ongoing basis, because this does go back to that older legacy type of tracker. Many questionnaires today are still in that 25 to 30-minute range, and frankly, even though we're all doing them, it's really too long. So I think, Bonnie, I don't know your thoughts exactly, but I think that what we would probably want to recommend is asking all of those really hard questions to try to get the survey down to those key must-know types of things, to slim it back to 15 minutes, right, if at all possible, and that is even long.
Right.
5 years from now, that's going to be too long.
Right. And I think 15 minutes is really pushing the maximum length right now. And again, we can use modules on some of the back-end questions that we can rotate. One of the other things to think about as well is if we're talking about customer experience that we want in the moment, if we are a restaurant or we are in a retail environment and we really want that consumer to respond right there, it really needs to be 5 minutes. So, you really have to start thinking about how we're going to do this, and we know there are some of our clients who are literally down to 5 or 10 key questions after the qualifications are done. So it's really important that we think about that. Of course, there are mobile surveys that can be tagged, and we know they're happening in the store, in the restaurant. So we really need to get down to something like 15 or maybe even 5 if we're talking about something in the moment.
One of the things that I always like to think about is, put yourself in the shoes of the participant or the respondent. And as research partners, we find ourselves, quality control checking questionnaires pretty frequently. And when you go through that questionnaire as a respondent, you really get their perspective on how long it is, how much time it takes. So I think that really helps highlight the need to slim things down and tighten things up.
Because obviously we want to make sure the respondents are representative of our consumers, as well as that's not an experience that is just causing them to click through and straight line data or whatever the case may be. So now let's talk a little bit more about best-in-class tracking. So you've designed the optimal questionnaire, everything's been tested to make sure the program's performance is looking good on all the various platforms. You've reviewed all the sampling plans and the surveys being fielded, and now we're really getting into the next big steps that are so important. First of all is analytics and looking at all of your big data sources. Try to get everything into a common denominator, for example, same time frame, same geographies. Again, make plans to include advanced analysis of the survey data. We're looking for ways to make this actionable and really provide deep insight. So the key drivers, multidimensional image mapping, as Felicia had mentioned. There's also modeling that can be done on brand equity or satisfaction indices. So again, we're looking for ways to take our data that's been collected in the best way possible and put it into very actionable results.
And Bonnie, if I can interrupt just for a second, I think one of the points you made there is, thinking about the big data, which means we're pulling together all different sources of data here. That could be social data, that could be sales data, that could be, all kinds of things. And, one of the things I think you're saying is we do really believe wholeheartedly that best-in-class tracking going forward is going to pull together data from all these sources. The survey is critical, but all the other data is really adding to the picture and helping us make the decisions that need to be made.
And that's really where it also kind of goes hand in hand with dashboards, which is the next topic, is we want to make sure you budgeted time and money to work on getting KPIs on all the stakeholder computers, laptops, whatever they're using. You want to make sure that they're seeing the data weekly, monthly, whatever cadence works for them, and make sure that they're able to improve the customer experiences. You can also set up red flag warnings if something goes out of norm over a certain time period, so that the right people who are the managers, who are the people, the salespeople, can take action on those. And again, this is where in the dashboard, as we talked about earlier, you can incorporate not just your tracking survey data, but all the key metrics for your business. We also want to take a look, you want to look at the in-depth analysis and make sure that you're looking at the results annually. We're looking for long-term trends. It is very important to make things actionable and to see things as they're happening, but it's also very important to look over the past 4 or 5 years or 10 years, depending on how long the base or massive part, key parts of your tracking have been in place, because some of those long-term trends can help you identify something that's going on, could be put into new product development or to other areas to help manage the business. So we're looking for those long-term trends. We also want to incorporate workshops, working sessions at the end of the first wave or first quarter. We also want to do that at the end of each year. It's important to make sure that the program is working, the key stakeholders are getting the key information they need at the time they need it, and in the way that it's most valuable to them in terms of making decisions on marketing. So really having those workshops, again, adds to the actionability of the tracking program.
We actually just had a question come in. Someone is asking, what are your thoughts about chunking up a survey and going out a few times over a period of, or I'm sorry, a few times, yeah, over a period of time. So basically they're asking, what about this 30-minute tracker that the other question was referencing? Can we break it into parts and maybe go, I'm just going to insert something that they didn't actually say, but what if we take and go out quarterly with that questionnaire or something like that? I think this kind of goes to the point that you made previously about micro surveys or putting together
like a module,
shorter modules.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. I think that's one of the things you have to do, and we realize this is a very difficult task, and many of our clients are struggling with this very issue. Your businesses are used to having this data, so you don't want to disappoint them and not have the data that they're used to having, but you're also walking that fine line of being that advocate and saying the data quality is not as good as it should be because we've stretched out this key question to a 30-minute questionnaire. So that's a very good point for the person who responded or asked that question. Chunking the questionnaire up, putting it in modules, breaking it up in some way is going to be really key to getting what the business needs as well as getting the right kinds of data and actionable data. We also had a question that just came in about B2B tracking and how that is different, or our thoughts about that, and I guess I'll start, and then Felicia, you can chime in. I mean, certainly in a B2B sense, you're typically looking at smaller sample sizes. Sample isn't as plentiful as it would be in the consumer world. Some of the key questions you'll be asking yourself is the survey blinded? I mean, do they know who's sponsoring the survey or do they not? If there is extreme difficulty in getting the sample, it may be based somewhat on a customer list that you have. So in that case, you may have to identify who you are, otherwise it doesn't provide the credence and the realism that they wouldn't be willing to talk to just anyone, but if they knew that you were the one that was the sponsor, they would. So there's some key questions there also around incentives, and do you offer incentives, and you know, if you're in a medical, pharmaceutical world, can you offer incentives? Is that okay? And how does that need to work?
Right, and I think there's also the issue of frequency. So if you are working with a relatively small industry, let's say, and there are only, you know, a limited number of customers or potential customers out there that you need to survey, you probably don't want to go back to them too often because they'll just begin to frankly be annoyed by that,
Right.
And the data will not really be as valuable as if you do it only once a year, maybe once every other year, depending on what the needs are and what types of things you're tracking.
So I think we're heading back to the presentation after those very good questions. Again, looking to make the tracking program more actionable.
Right. So one of the things you talked about, I guess, on our last slide was analytics and modeling. And so here, this is just an example. It's just an idea of some of the types of modeling, or a type of modeling that we can do with data. And this would certainly be from sort of a brand health tracker or a brand equity tracker. And the model itself that's shown on the screen is a brand equity model. It could be kind of intimidating to look at because it's got all these moving parts, but we shouldn't let that intimidate us, because what really the key is that we're looking at here is getting from the column on the left, which lays out a variety of attributes that were most likely rated inside of a survey, and moving our way over to the right-hand side, which is the market outcomes that we're looking for. So what a model like this can do for us is to help us understand the levers, if you will, that we can pull. So again, on the far left, we're looking at things like product quality and variety, attributes like it's a fun, exciting brand, things like that. What are the things that we can actually make an impact on or change that will in turn affect a market outcome that we're looking for, like purchase or future visitation, or things like consideration of a brand or likelihood to recommend. So a scoring system or a model like this can help us understand what things are really driving those final outcomes, and as marketers, how we can have an impact on them.
And one of the things we've already talked about a few times is KPIs and the key performance indicators. And here we really wanted to discuss this in just a little bit more detail. You have a number of things that are coming from the tracking program, and again, depending on your business, it's awareness, familiarity, consideration, purchase, or likely to recommend. Again, brands that you would be willing to pay more for are really important. But then there's all the other sources of data that are coming from your other big data sources outside of the tracking program. What are the volume of sales, distribution, profit, looking at your media spending, your FSIs, promotional, social media. So again, it's really about trying to combine all the key aspects of data as much as you can gather together to really help your key decision makers make the decisions they need to make. And again, this goes right to making the tracking program more actionable. Even though tracking may be a portion but not the whole thing, it's about integrating all of this across the business.
And then in terms of reporting results out, we know that, again, speed and timeliness is of the essence. So there are a number of ways to do that. A small report can be published on a weekly basis. All kinds of things can be done to make sure that data and insights are getting into the hands of your stakeholders. And dashboards are another example that many people are using and that we believe will continue to be very important. This is a way where you can bring together data from various sources, all those key performance indicators that Bonnie was just talking about. But the most important part here, or the most important thing really, is to make sure that what you have for your audience fits their needs. So the ability to kind of customize the dashboard to show, again, the KPIs that your stakeholders need. Most often what you'll want to do is have the ability to include those for the right audience at the right time and to be able to track them over time. So you likely will want to build in different levels of permission, for example, so that the CEO has a different view compared to a regional manager, for example. The CEO, of course, needs a top-level view. Your middle managers that are over certain lines of business or areas of the business need to see different data, different performance indicators that impact their jobs directly and their staff. and then that regional manager needs to see his or her numbers just from their own local area. So those kinds of things can be done with various forms of dashboard reporting, and it really helps us to make this data actionable and not just something that, you know, is there that may or may not be useful.
And so as we were working on this presentation, we had a few industry leaders, and these all happened to be from the client side, give us a few comments based on their business and what's going on in their company. And we thought that it might be interesting to share with you, as we know many of you are struggling with this too. You'll see a lot of the themes around fast-paced business environment, making the results actionable, combining data of various sources, as well as timeliness. So we're not going to read these to you. You guys can just take a look at them. But again, I think many clients and many different industries are struggling with how to make the tracking programs right for the future. And so you can see many of those things going on.
Yeah, I mean, these quotes really do tell an interesting and I would say kind of a very tight story.
Mm-hmm.
Many people are thinking the same things, and even, you know, as a supplier partner, we have done many tracking studies over the years, and we've worked through some of these very issues with our clients, and we've seen some of our clients, you know, having to make tough decisions, having to scale back, having to kind of change their approach.
So in conclusion, go
yeah,
ahead.
So to just summarize, thank you for sticking with us for a half an hour or so here. Really, as we conclude the talk and the thinking about tracking of the future, we certainly know that tracking research is not dead. There are many reasons that companies still need to track their results, but we also know that it can't really remain the same. It has to be streamlined. We've got to make things a little easier to deal with. We also know that we need to combine tracking data with other sources of data. Again, we've said this many times, just to make sure that we stay relevant, that things are actionable, and then the timeliness, we've got to make sure that we're kind of in that right time frame and reporting quickly so that going back to kind of the speed of light that we talked about early on, our world is moving very fast, and tracking data that comes out 3 months later is often just not useful anymore. So we recognize, and we know you all recognize, that we've got to move faster as the future goes for tracking research. And then engaging those stakeholders up front, but also throughout the whole process to make sure that we're asking the right questions that are going to help them do their jobs better, but also to keep them engaged and on board with the type of tracking that we're doing. And we talked a lot about the dashboards and modeling and how to report those things out.
Right. And I think we have, those were essentially the thoughts we had to share, and I know we've had a couple of questions.
Yeah, one question came in that certainly fits right in with the things that we've been talking about. And someone asks, how do you recommend integrating the social data into the quantitative survey results? Would you combine the reports or keep them separate?
Well, and we've, you know, we've had this question and thought about this with our other clients in the past, and we actually believe there's a lot of value to putting things together and telling a compelling story that combines that data. And again, part of it depends on what your organization is looking at right now, what they're used to seeing in that format. But as much as you can, I think combining them together, and then obviously you would be noting where they came from. I mean, a general representation of a tracking study is probably a very different audience than the followers of the brand on a Facebook, for example. However, all that being said, I think all are valuable. They just need to be noted as to what they are.
And I think, to your point, that really helps bring it all to life. It helps kind of come at the story from many different angles, and we all know that today's reporting style needs to be much more of sort of a story-driven report. And so having all those different aspects incorporated into the same report is extremely helpful and useful. Let me see if there are any other questions. Okay, there's a question here. Do you recommend having a shorter survey for mobile users and a longer survey for desktop users? That's a really interesting. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, and I think it kind of plays into, it is a great question, and I think it kind of plays into the whole idea of taking something that's kind of big and clunky and trying to streamline it. So certainly where you are doing something and trying to understand an in-the-moment reaction and in-the-moment attitude of a consumer, it's important that it be short and sweet. And so there may be some key questions that can overlap between the mobile and the non-mobile, but there may be some questions that you still want more in-depth, and doing it not on a mobile device is probably the smart way to go.
I would agree. And actually, I think we have time for one last question, and it works out perfectly because there's a question that is kind of related here. What are your thoughts about chunking up, in quotes, a survey and going out a few times over a period of time? So much in the same way that you might go out and target mobile users with a shorter questionnaire version, but making sure that you've got those key, those really key core questions. You can also divide up a survey into sections, if you will. Maybe you start with a core of questions and you ask those questions in the first week, and then the next time you're in the field, you've got other core questions that address a slightly different topic but relate back to the core. And those questions are asked in a slightly different time frame, and perhaps there's a third chunk of questions that get asked in yet another time frame. But then, again, in the same way that we're pulling data together from multiple sources like social and sales data and tracking data, all of those can be pulled together in the same report as well to help shape the story.
Right. And I think that's really the key here, as we've said, is trying to work with your organization. What is the data that they're used to seeing that they have to have? What parts of it can evolve so that we can keep an eye on getting a less fatigued respondent, get better quality data, but still give our organizations what they need. I think that's all the time we have for questions right now. Any other questions you would like to send to us, we'd be happy to answer those individually. And at this point, I'm going to hand the presentation back over to Christy.
Well, thank you, Felicia and Bonnie, and thank you everyone for attending today's Insider Series webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to email either Felicia or Bonnie. The webinar deck is in the handout section. It's called the Future of Tracking Webinar Print, and it's PDF, and it will be there for you to download. Or if you like us to email you a copy of it, please send me an email and we can do that. Our next Insider Series webinar will be Wednesday, March 8th. Decision Analyst Jerry Thomas will be presenting on sales forecasting for durables. We hope you enjoyed today's session and are looking forward to seeing you for next month's webinar. And have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.